Hey guys! So today I want to talk about a real feminist, Donald Trump, and the enemies of feminism. Feminism. Hello friends! So today I want to look at, or maybe even deconstruct, a group of people who have sort of run in the periphery of the media spotlight for quite a while now, and who really haven't seen much attention outside of their own communities barring a few notable exceptions. Now, I'm gonna stop leading you on since this is a YouTube video and you can already see from the title that we're going to be talking about the women of the alt-right. Specifically, in this deconstruction, as I so labeled it earlier, I want to focus on a few key areas. Those being the rise of notable women in the alt-right, like content producers on YouTube or other lesser-known platforms, as well as break down the broader ideology and psychology that goes into radicalizing and introducing women into this group, and some of the rhetoric used to do so. There's not going to be a huge focus on refuting alt-right talking points here, since, the video is sort of predicated on the general knowledge that the alt-right itself has a largely male-dominated and misogynistic culture. And understanding the women of the movement really doesn't require a full knowledge of their often contradictory and self-defeating talking points, although a few of them relevant to the topic will definitely be addressed. I'm going to substantiate my criticism, but that's all really secondary to the point of the topic. What I'm mostly trying to get at in the next however many minutes is an understanding of this.
A stable marriage and children are statistically one of the highest predictors of happiness in a woman's life, and your chances of having either of those things diminish over time as you push them back for partying, for work, for education, or for finding yourself, whatever it may be.
So that was a girl named Lauren Southern talking about the value of traditional marriage, and she sort of acted as my cheeky little segue into the first major aspect of this video. Now, what she was talking about isn't going to come up for a little bit, because we want to talk about her for now. Not her specifically, but the larger crop of women who have made a name for themselves, or at the very least some considerable Patreon revenue by pumping out traditional alt-right video content. Wait. The Kent State gun girl has one guy giving her $100 a month for a personalized birthday video? What? So yeah. Them. Now, I'm not including traditional female conservative pundits in this group because they exist a little bit outside of focus, even if some of their rhetoric has begun rapidly cozying up to the alt-right anyway. What we want to look at right now is the group of independent content creators like Caitlin Bennett, Lauren Southern, Blair White, Lena Lockteff, the list goes on because they are somewhat unique, representing what was up to this point really considered to be a negligible or just non-existent portion of actual alt-right membership. Women. So the logic goes, by understanding them and their content, or even by just examining it because the mind of such a person is far too scary to inhabit, maybe we can get a better glimpse not only into why more women appear to be joining the group, but also why a group that hates women so much would even make space for them in the first place. But before we get into all that theory crafting, let's take a census of what these YouTube channels even look like. Now, there's a decent bit of variation on how the outward-facing women of the movement present themselves, but there definitely seems to be a median. And it is, to say the least, threateningly basic. For example, here's a picture of Lauren Southern. Just kidding, that's actually Lena Lockteff, a different alt-right figure. This is her. And by her, I mean Millie Weaver, a prominent conspiracy peddler we'll talk about later. This, and I mean it this time, is Lauren Southern. Shit, that's Ivanka Trump. Okay, now this one is her. Hopefully you're starting to see the point here. Self-styling after a mix between right-wing anti-SJW rants and Jenna Marbles vlogs, most of these women of the alt-right are really just that. Young, white, conventionally attractive, conservative women with decent cameras who film themselves vlogging along to some alt-right talking points. And these style channels, the ones that really just look like SJW cringe comps with amped up rhetoric, are certainly the most popular, boasting subscription numbers fairly on par with other big-name boys in alt-right circles. But then to either side of these channels exists some slightly less popular, differently styled content. When not filming birthday greetings, Kent State gun girl Caitlin Bennett and prominent not Lauren Southern Millie Weaver serve more traditional roles as news performers at InfoWars, and recreating more of a suburban talk show TV feel, Lena Lockteff spends her time making various content on her own platform, Red Ice, which mostly appeals to other women and hosts a variety of white nationalist girls on her different podcasts. And we'll get to all that in due time. But really, the overall content being produced by women in the alt-right is almost indistinguishable from the stuff being made by the guys like Ben Shapiro or Nicholas Fuentes, with a couple key deviations. First, in addition to whatever racist nonsense is being propagated in these videos, the women of the alt-right put an even more increased focus on a concept which has come to be known as tradwifing, which is essentially just promoting and to some degree fetishizing the traditional gender roles of wives before, as the fairy tale goes, feminism destroyed the nuclear family. Now, the concept of a traditional wife is really important to everyone in the alt-right. I mean, it is central in pretty much any of the incel-driven discourse covering topics concerning female autonomy and ways to just do away with it. But to the women in the movement, especially these outer-facing content creators, embodying that ideal and reiterating that it is important not only to the men seemingly strong-arming women into this worldview, but also the loving wives supporting from the back lines is essential. And it's pretty clear why, considering that the response to many of the aforementioned women gaining any sort of traction online, while sometimes a positive and bizarre Aryan fetishization, is often an accusatory questioning of why these women themselves aren't 3 children deep into a family by the age of 25. In fact, such criticism even became enough to the point that Lauren Southern herself had to film a video titled Why I'm Not Married, in which she essentially argued for her own bodily autonomy while simultaneously reiterating her own seething distaste for the breakdown of traditional families caused by feminism. And that brings us into the second deviation from traditional alt-right content. Basically, where typical big-name content creators either only passingly reference or just completely ignore the question of women in the movement, the girls making content, spotlight aimed squarely at them, double down and not only defend enforcing a traditional role for women in society, but also happily explain how the welcoming ideology of the alt-right has provided luxuries and protection in a way that filthy feminism never could. While the Lauren Southern video might be an example of cognitive dissonance at an all-time high, it's actually quite representative of the often-toed alt-right position on women. That is, they simply project the idea that the alt-right is great for them, and that where feminism has been a destructive force compelling women to abandon their roles as wives and mothers, conservative ideals have reinforced biological realism and kept women safe and fulfilled. To do this, the women of the alt-right often quite glaringly borrow from feminist rhetoric in describing the goals of the alt-right in answering its rather persistent woman question. They talk about very real economic and physical threats faced by women in modern society, but instead of prescribing greater autonomy and opportunity as the solution, self-styled pundits ascribe these problems to the feminist movement itself, saying that it essentially stole a woman's option to live in this perceived traditional way. In the same way social justice is reduced to an SJW strawman in the rational skeptic YouTube communities, feminism is turned into a caricature of itself, while alt-right ideals are dangled above it as the true progressive option that a woman can take. Now, all of this is sufficiently concerning in its own right. I mean, it represents not only the complete discounting of feminism's history of advancing the capabilities of women, but creates a false reality where being a traditional wife is no longer an option in the leftist hellhole that has become the United States. And it says that feminism is the sole reason for this reality, which, by the way, does not exist. But all of this doesn't even get at the more basic, fundamental question that needs to underscore all of this. Why? What could possibly be the motivating reasons for a woman to join a group that is so openly hostile to them? What could lead someone to attribute the successes of feminism to anything but the movement itself? Well, it's complicated. The best place to start, though, might be with a key theme you might have noticed by this point in the video. Feminism. But hatred for the movement, or the conceptualization of it as something antithetical to the goals of traditional marriage are not the starting reasons a woman would have for joining the alt-right, or at least they typically wouldn't be. Instead, that rhetoric represents the final understanding of someone already absorbed into the movement. So, adoption into this belief likely starts somewhere a lot more benign. It starts with misunderstanding. Now, this misunderstanding of the feminist movement manifests in a few notable ways. Firstly, that widely circulated anti-SJW content on YouTube? Well, it gets around. And not just to alt-right individuals already deeply entrenched in that sort of content either. It's no secret that for a long time, YouTube videos recommendation algorithm did a lot of work propagating so-called SJW cringe compilations, and the rantings of self-titled rational skeptics attacking liberal strawman arguments or cultivating general fake outrage. And videos like this, which have existed for years now, have served not only to create the commonly cited but rarely witnessed image of an overly emotional, irrational, and ridiculous social justice warrior, but also to make every movement associated with them, from Black Lives Matter to feminism itself, appear to be the movements of overly emotional, irrational, and ridiculous individuals. With this framework in mind, and this content already having been digested, when a generally non-political person or someone with conservative tendencies being targeted for radicalization by the alt-right is told, not only are those silly people stupid, they're also actively bad and dangerous, it isn't a hard leap to mentally make. Additionally, misunderstandings of feminism are cultivated in a much more systemic and targeted way. The alt-right generally, and especially in opposition to feminism, harkens back to a glamorized vision of 1950s domestic living, what is seen as an era of unparalleled American prosperity. Then, in a cruel revision of history, the gradual decline in women's ability to act as stay-at-home wives, instead of being linked to the stagnation of wages and decline in upward economic mobility, is blamed on feminism itself. As Annie Kelly of the New York Times writes, we shouldn't underestimate how some young white women, when faced with this bleak economic landscape and then presented with a rosy image of 1950s domestic bliss, may look back to 1960s feminism as having cheated them out of a family and luxurious lifestyle all supported by a single income. And that last quote gets at the next reason women in general would be inclined to join the alt-right. And simply stated, it's that some people have a genuine desire to live in traditional, conservative gender roles. Now, obviously the reality is that feminism doesn't even exclude women from these positions, it merely opens up options beyond them. But when combined with the targeted misinformation discussed previously, it's clear how some women could be turned against feminism itself with little convincing, finding themselves sucked down the alt-right rabbit hole. The commonly espoused gender realism rhetoric, which claims that women and men are inherently unequal but still serve complementary roles, is genuinely appealing to some people. And we see the ways this manifests in the common talking points of, I just don't think that's women's work, or I hate how effeminate liberal men are. There is undeniably a constituency for traditional gender roles, and by misrepresenting the option to deviate from them as a mandate to do so, the alt-right is efficiently recruiting individuals who already have typical conservative leanings, playing off of them to get a foot in the door. But a misunderstanding of feminism doesn't give us the full image of the psychology which would make someone more likely to be radicalized by the alt-right. There's another, much broader element of their rhetoric which is used not only to pull people into these insular communities, but to do so with a sense of urgency. Fear. Fear is literally the core of conservative ideology. Fear of change representing the contour of almost every argument you will see made. That said, fear also then represents a much more systemic, inherent within one's own ideology and therefore more difficult to diffuse issue. To put the ism on its head, facts might not care about your feelings, but when your own ideology is rooted in your feelings, well, then it becomes a lot easier to not care about the facts either. Just to gloss over a few ways that fear plays a dominant role in crafting alt-right ideology, we can look at a few of their key issues. First up, the idea of cultural erasure, maybe even referred to as white genocide in the more firmly neo-Nazi circles of the alt-right, is the essential building block that formed the ideology. And obviously, it is based around fear. A fear which has over time boiled over into hatred and been targeted at immigrants, as well as natives who just don't look white. The idea of cultural erasure is really just a myth constructed around the fear of cultural change and integration over time, especially in response to periods of intense globalization. In America, where white people across the country are still keen to identify proudly as Italian or German or 145th Cherokee, the argument that immigrants and not white enough citizens are somehow less able to integrate into society is laughable. Cultural erasure is nothing more than racist fear-mongering masquerading as legitimate concerns regarding the cohesion of a culture which is historically far from monolithic. Additionally, changes in economic prosperity and fear for people's futures and livelihoods is a huge motivating factor not only for members of the alt-right but conservatives at large. Like most complicated issues in a world that is increasingly interconnected, the political right usually takes this opportunity to harp against immigrants and foreigners and simplifies the discourse by creating an enemy that can both be sufficiently feared and physically expelled. But, stripping the racially charged and grossly simplified rhetoric aside, this core motivating fear is common and probably even sympathetic to people from all over the political spectrum. However, instead of critiquing the economic system which has allowed for such hoarding of capital, or the political establishments that have made themselves reservoirs for corporate funding, or even engaging with the concept of wage stagnation, the alt-right makes the threat, and its solution, much less complex. Your jobs are being taken by immigrants, and by removing them we can restore economic prosperity. And it is precisely the simplicity, as well as the physicality of this image which has so much resonance with people already entrenched in an ideology of fear. Now, for the most part, all of this talk about fear has been seemingly absent one key concept: women. For the most part, the fearful rhetoric employed by the alt-right is gender transient. The threats they have constructed are applicable to anyone and readily understood. This is all true, however, with one key exception, and this is where the content warning in the description comes into play. Rape. The threat of physical harm is already prevalent in right discourse. The term thug has obvious implications, but a unique and specifically twisted way the alt-right tries to radicalize women is with the constant, explicit threat of rape being levied against them. Lena Lochtef, one of the content creators I mentioned earlier who makes podcast-style radio shows aimed at non-radicalized women, said in an interview that the key way she appeals to women who are wary of jumping from conservative to white nationalist is to, quote, remind them that they are under constant threat from black and brown men, using the sinister idea of a rape scourge to induct them. With these elements of psychology and ideology considered, we can see the alt-right mentality and reality colliding into this very weird space. And in it, women are both necessary and fetishized while simultaneously being demonized by the incel subculture prominent in these circles. And while we see this manifest in really large ways, like the actual proliferation of female content creators combined with the intense backlash they receive, we also see it in more minute ones. For example, Blair White is often held up as a symbol of diversity and tolerance among the alt-right given that she is a trans woman who espouses conservative beliefs, especially those surrounding SJW culture. However, this could then be easily compared to any given member of the alt-right's outward-facing stance on trans issues, and we can begin to see some clear contradictions. Inside the community, comment sections on subreddits like The Donald are composed of two incompatible narratives. Either, we understand trans issues and Blair White is the best, most attractive one and she's on our side, or trans individuals are mentally ill and we should expel them from the community. And while we might hope that these things are indicative of larger fractures and infighting, they really aren't. In an ideology already rife with constant pivoting and moving of goalposts, completely 180ing on a stance to fit the narrative in a given moment is almost exactly what one would expect. Another thing we're seeing in the Twilight Zone that has become the alt-right is simply the expansion of what we originally thought of as the domain they occupied. Where branded into many people's minds are the images of tiki torches and chanting in the streets, the alt-right has been deliberately working to start appealing to more moderate people, women especially. And to do this, they have begun creating a media environment that looks entirely unassuming. Red Ice, the media platform created by Lena Lockteff I mentioned earlier, just looks like some random suburban reality TV show's website, and the content on it dons the same disguise, playing itself off as some harmless chat show made for women by women. Lockteff's radio shows introduce some really extreme white nationalist concepts with a smile on its face, and in a way that is clearly targeted at suburban white women. This change in the alt-right media scene is hard to perceive, but it certainly isn't unprecedented. In fact, it's just a repetition of what we saw before Charlottesville, where rational skeptics donned suit jackets and new haircuts to replace the image of a skinhead with fascist face tattoos. The adoption of women into the alt-right is obviously not a change born of ideological shift. The place of women in the movement is still quite regularly degraded and demeaned, and if that's the case, then it represents something else. The drive to recruit out of necessity. Out of the desire not to temper the movement, but to give it the image of temperament and agreeability while maintaining authoritarian extremist leanings. We can look at it as the camouflage effect that white women have on a movement. Lockteff even acknowledged it when she says that, quote, "Since we aren't physically intimidating, women can get away with saying big things." It is extremely unpopular and difficult to paint an unassuming, young, white girl as an existential threat to our country. So, dangerous ideologies can quite easily use them as useful tools to dodge or preemptively diffuse criticism. The image of a suburban mom just fighting for her community and her freedom is what has largely shielded anti-vaxxing from being wiped off the face of the earth and how quickly it should be discredited. And in the same way, personalities like Lauren Southern and Millie Weaver are by design going to provide the image of an agreeable, American ideology that could never be as violent as the radical left makes it out to be. In essence, the adoption of women into the movement is the way of transitioning the alt-right into the mainstream. And if that's their strategy, then everyone else's job is to ring the bells and signal what all of this really means ad nauseum. And yes, pointing at and calling attractive white girls Nazis is never going to be a winning move, and it even contributes to the idea that the left is far more radical than the actual factual neo-Nazi movement in the US. But that doesn't make it not apt. And while these girls might be serving as useful tools to shield the movement, the truth remains that anyone trying to discredit the alt-right doesn't need to go far to dig up rhetoric and imagery that the apolitical public is much less sympathetic towards. If Lena Lockteff is creating new content and screening new episodes of Real Housewives of the Ethno-State, well, that's dangerous. But for us to watch it happen and become the norm is deadly.